Have you all heard of the Moral Majority? Well, if you haven't, the Moral Majority was a political organization formed in the late 1970s by Jerry Falwell Sr. with the express goal of mobilizing conservative Christians into politics. And one of their most animating causes was abortion. See, if you ask an evangelical Christian why the evangelical church is so involved in politics, they'll tell you that when Roe versus Wade passed, evangelical Christians felt they had a moral obligation to oppose that law, and therefore they became politically active. Right? Now, what if I told you that's only half true? Because here's the thing. Abortion is how evangelical Christians got into politics, but it actually isn't the reason why. In fact, I don't think the evangelical church wants you to know the reason why. So to understand that, we have to go back to 1954. I got some notes. So in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education decision came about. So that was the decision that desegregated schools. Right, so this didn't make the white Christians happy down south, right? They were very, very much opposed to that because they believed that segregation was ordained. They genuinely believed God wanted separation. So what did they do? So in response, they set up private religious schools. And they did this under the justification of we have private rights as Christians. So they basically created private schools where only white students were there. They were essentially called segregation academies. So this is what went on from around 1954 onwards. Fast forward to 1970. So 1970, the IRS announces that, hey, listen, we're going to start taking away the tax-exempt status of schools, of private schools that continue to be segregated. Now, they just made the announcement. They didn't really do anything about it, but then this was an existential threat to the evangelical community, right? So this is when they basically started organizing. Nothing's happened yet, but they're starting to organize. Fast forward to 1973. Roe versus Wade passes. Now, here's what's interesting, though. When it passed, what do you think was the response from evangelical Christians? It was crickets. They were completely apathetic to it. In fact, they called it a Catholic problem. They said abortion was a Catholic problem. They didn't care. So 1970s is going on. The evangelical Christian church is becoming more and more organized. They're basically coming together. And the way that they're becoming organized is the evangelical leaders are basically saying, hey, the government is trying to interfere in our religious rights. We have religious freedoms in this country. The government is trying to interfere with that, right? So that's how they're building their political base. Fast forward to 1978. So in 1978, the IRS starts getting serious. The IRS is like, listen, we're going to take away the tax-exempt status of schools that continue to be segregated. And they actually announced how they were going to do it. So now this is the point where the evangelical church is like, okay, we have to spring into action. But the problem was they couldn't actually spring into action based on their reasoning, right? Because it wouldn't be popular for them to say that we're fighting against the government because we want to continue to segregate our schools. That wouldn't have worked. They wouldn't have been able to sustain that. So they needed to find another reason. What did they find? Abortion, right? It was easy. It was right there. So they basically championed abortion. And luckily, they had the perfect amoral candidate in mind, Ronald Reagan. Now, in 1979, Ronald Reagan said something at one of his, a dinner or something. He was expressly speaking out to the evangelical community. And what he said was, I know you can't endorse me, but understand that I will always endorse you. So he's talking to the evangelical community. Do you know why he said that you can't endorse me? Because who was running against Reagan? Carter, right? Born again Christian, Sunday school teacher, farmer, literally the very definition of the thing that the evangelical Christians wanted, right? Ronald Reagan wasn't that. Ronald Reagan was divorced. Ronald Reagan was an actor. Ronald Reagan was the one who signed the abortion into law in California, right? But he was on their side. So the election happens. Reagan wins in a landslide. And if you look back at a lot of that was because the evangelical Christians turned out an overwhelming support for him. And that's all she wrote. And from that point onwards, the evangelical Christian church was a part of politics. But I want you to remember something. Their reason was racism, right? So that's why you should not be surprised that there's that thread of racism that runs in a lot of these decisions that are coming out now, because a lot of them are evangelical Christians. Anyway, that's my long-winded history. I hope you guys get something out of it. Would love to hear your thoughts. Have a good one.